Okay, have you ever had to learn a lesson the hard way? Yeah, me too. In fact, most of the important lessons in my life I've had to learn the hard way, and they really tend to stick. Sometimes when we talk about God's grace, we're talking about the wonderful things that make us feel good and how God is being good to us, but sometimes God is being good to us in pain or in loss. Sometimes the lessons come the hard way, and that too is God's grace. That's what we're talking about this week on the live show.
Kindred UMC live show features adults discussing adult topics, occasionally with adult language. It may not be suitable for young viewers. Please use discretion before watching.
Hello all! Welcome once again to the Kindred UMC pre-recorded live show, coming to you not live, but pre-recorded from my front room, aka Kindred Studio A. My name is Chris Hayden. I'm the pastor of Kindred UMC.
Hey, I'm Courtney Young. I am the lay delegate at Kindred UMC.
And I'm Ann, and I am the treasurer for Kindred UMC.
And bookkeeper.
And bookkeeper.
And office coordinator.
And secretary, but not the janitor.
I try not to use the word secretary. I don't have a problem with it, but I find that other people do, so...
I don't know, what is...
Well, because I think it became like, it implied like gendered stuff, rather than like an actual... You're managing the office,
Yeah.
So I like office coordinator or office manager. Anyway. I digress. Let's jump right into it. We're in our second week, our final week. We've only done 2 weeks of this, and because it's a little in-betweeny time, of the minor prophets. And so we shall be reading from a lesser-known prophet called Amos. And it's only a few chapters long. Well, when I say a few, it's like 6 or 7. What is it? It's 6 or 7. And we're going to be reading specifically from chapter 4. It's a weird number, okay? It's chapter 4, verse 6 through chapter 5, verse 4. So this is kind of like it's like we're splitting the chapters up a little bit. So here they go. They go like this. And this is written in verse, so it's like poetry. It's important to know that. I gave you cleanness of teeth in all your cities and lack of bread in all your places. Cleanness of teeth sounds weird because that's something we want, cleanness of teeth. Cleanness of teeth in this day and age means like you're not eating. So cleanness of teeth is like you don't have any meat on your teeth because you're starving. Okay, so God is saying, I gave you cleanness of teeth in all your cities and lack of bread in all your places, yet you did not return to me, says Yahweh. And I also withheld the rain from you when there were still 3 months in the harvest. I would send rain on one city and send no rain on another city. One field would be rained upon, and the field on which it did not rain withered. Obviously, rain is an important thing. Like this is sources of food and livelihood. So 2 or 3 towns wandered to one town to drink water and were not satisfied. Yet you did not return, says Yahweh. I struck you with blight and mildew. I laid waste your gardens and your vineyards. The locust devoured your fig trees and your olive trees. Yet you did not return to me, says Yahweh. I sent among you a pestilence after the manner of Egypt. So I sent to you pestilence just like I did in the book of Exodus when we were in Egypt enslaved. I killed your young men with the sword. I carried away your horses, and I made the stench of your camp go up into your nostrils. Yet you did not return to me, says Yahweh. I overthrew some of you as when Elohim. This is interesting because God's referring to himself in the third person and using a different name than Yahweh. So every time you see Lord, capital L-O-R-D, that's Yahweh. That's the personal name for Israel, for God. That's the rescuer. That's the one who came and like heard the cry of Israel and rescued them from Egypt. And Elohim is like the big, grand creator of all. Like these two names kind of depict two different aspects. And so says Yahweh is like, says your personal God, but then he's also reminding them that I'm also the big one who did everything. Like there's kind of like a behind it. I overthrew some of you as when Elohim overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, and you were like a brand snatched from the fire, yet you did not return to me, says Yahweh. Therefore, thus I will do to you, O Israel. Because I will do this to you, prepare to meet your God, O Israel. For lo, the one who forms the mountains, creates the wind, reveals his thoughts to mortals, makes the morning darkness, and treads in the heights of the earth. Yahweh, the God of hosts, is his name. Or probably a better translation, Yahweh Elohim is his name. Again, reminding personal and like Big Daddy, Hear this word that I take up over you in lamentation, O house of Israel. Fallen no more to rise is maiden Israel, forsaken on her land, with no one to raise her up. For thus says Yahweh Elohim, the city that marched out 1,000 shall have 100 left, and that which marched out 100 shall have 10 left. For thus says the Lord to the house of Israel, seek me and live. So, nice uplifting message for everyone out there who might be struggling. We're struggling with some inflation and some natural recession. This is just a nice encouraging word that I thought everybody could use in this day and age. All right, let's pray and let's get out of here then. This is a stark judgment word. And as we talked about, some context matters. And if you want more of the context, go look at last week's video. But essentially, this is in the time where Israel reaches its height and then has civil war and splits. And there's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. Southern kingdom's where Jerusalem is and Judea, and that's where we get Jews, because the southern kingdom or the northern kingdom ends up being conquered. And so Israel becomes Judea only. The reason for that split, however, is because Solomon is like the height, like David and Solomon. They're the kings of Israel. They're like the height of Israel. Solomon got critique because he was incredibly wealthy and there was a lot of decadence. And so the northern kingdoms split because they are criticizing the southern kingdoms, and specifically Solomon, for ignoring the cry of the needy, and basically having a top 1%. Wealth distribution is incredibly uneven, and so they're like, we're gonna split. And have you ever heard the phrase a geographical solution?
I don't think so.
Mm-mm.
Okay, so it's an ironic term. So have you ever been in a place where things aren't going well and you're like, maybe I should just move?
Yeah.
I had a little bit of a season like that in my own life when this is right before my first marriage fell apart, actually. And I didn't want to really face the things that were causing the problems in the relationship. And I didn't do it, but I had this really what if we just moved to New York?
Yeah.
It's but that's a geographical solution.
Right.
And what always happens with a geographical solution is your problems tend to follow you. So that's kind of what happens here. The northern kingdom is like, you guys are being greedy and bad and 1%, and we're going to split. And then what ends up happening in the northern kingdom is the top 1% end up oppressing the rest of, and stealing from the poor, and all of the same problems, they just follow them. This is the word of the Lord to that kingdom. You're not following my word, and so this is what's going to happen. Now, here's what's interesting. Usually in a prophet like this, the kind of the structure of that, dude, my dog is licking his bed. I'm worried it's coming through the mics. It's gross. Stop it. The normal structure of a prophetic word that's written down like this, the prophet in this section would actually be reminding people of the good things that God has done. So there would be things like, remember when you were enslaved in Egypt and how I came to rescue you. Remember when you were in the desert and starving and how I gave you food. Remember when your enemies were at your doors and how I delivered you in victory. That's not what this says at all. This says, hey, Remember when you weren't doing what I said and then I withheld food from you? Remember when you weren't doing what I said and then I killed several of your young men? Remember, like it's the opposite, and it's a very deliberate opposite. This Amos is kind of taking the format and like turning it on its head. And he's actually speaking to the people of Israel to say, hey, things haven't been going well for you. Would you like to know why? You know, like he's kind of reinforcing like, yeah, there's a reason that things are not going well. So I wanted to talk this week about, because often when we talk about God and we talk specifically about God's grace, we tend to have like a positive view of that. Like God's grace usually comes but I also think the American church is maybe a little too far on the side of like, yeah, if you just smile and have good posture, then everything's going to work out great for you. And we tend to neglect the things that, no, God is speaking in all things, and often God's grace comes in the form of things not working out or things being painful, and God is kind of calling us back to something when things are not going well. So what I want to ask you guys is, what comes up in your mind when we talk about lessons that God has taught us in the midst of either pain or loss or things not working out? And I'm happy to go first because I definitely have had times like this in my own life.
I can go. I mean, really, they all come with pain, right? Like, what lesson have you had that didn't come with some kind of like smack, right? Like they all.
Isn't that interesting? I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's some level of that, and I think, I have an uncle that's well known in the family for saying something along the lines of, "We'd like to take thinking out of the equation because it hurts. So like people don't want to think, so we just don't make them because that's hard." And I think there's a level of like, what lesson haven't we learned from having to go through like a painful situation? I mean, that when I was, as you're saying all that, like I can't pinpoint a specific situation where I'm like, oh, I really learned this lesson from that painful situation. But I'm also very stubborn, so I probably had to learn the same lesson like 8 times. And then I was like, oh, that's what I was supposed to get out of that.
That's also a very human experience. Yeah.
But, trying to remember like, oh, I'm allowed to take time for myself. Like I don't have to do everything for everybody else and ignore me. You got to like burn yourself out. How many times?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my big one as I was reading this is the second time I preached on this, and so I was kind of rereading it, and the one that came up for me this time was, and I already kind of tipped my hat a little bit, that my first marriage that fell apart, like I spent so much time ignoring, like I had no business marrying that person, and I was ignoring, I was numbing the pain. I was not paying attention to all the signs that were there. And I was just like insisting upon my own way, making that relationship. Now, and I always have to caveat this. I'm not saying that had we both turned into each other and like really done the work and, and made that relationship work, I believe that God can absolutely be good in that. So like, I'm not trying to let anybody off the hook from the commitments that we've made. But for me, the thing that I realized after it had fallen apart and through the pain of that lesson, the lesson that stood out to me was like, oh, I was just ignoring so much because I didn't want to feel the pain of loneliness. I didn't want to suffer through just the human experience of like, I don't know what I'm doing here and I don't know how to be. And it wasn't until I started doing those things after that relationship fell apart that then I began to like understand the person that God was calling me to be. It was truly, I mean, it's hard to label a lesson. It was more like a whole series of like me coming into my own and becoming a new creation in the midst of that death, which is, the metaphor of the cross and the resurrection,
right.
Like that was one of the most profound experiences of that for me. And it was like God's grace was in the things that were hurting me and the things that I was afraid to talk about or even look at. But that was God's grace. God's grace was in those things that were dark and kind of painful. What comes up for you, Courtney?
I mean, a lot. I feel like the one I most commonly talk about is, my parents divorced, so I'm not going to talk about that one this time. For me, the thing that came up was for a long time.
Welcome to the preacher's
Yes.
predicament. Like, okay, I'm talking about this one again, I guess.
Yeah, I was in a really verging on toxic church situation for a long time where, a pastor that, and I knew you at this time, we were working together in a different job, and I just so badly wanted to belong and to fit in and to be a part. And this pastor would constantly talk about how I was too much and I could never be a leader and this, that, and the other. And it was really hard because all I wanted to do was be a part of that organization and to be a leader in that context. And I made a bunch of friends within that organization, and I was determined to make it work, make it happen, whatever. But now I'm realizing,
what does it take to make it work?
Compromising who I am, and
right.
A lot of self-minimization.
Yeah, a lot of numbing, a lot of defense mechanisms, a lot of coping with the pain. Yeah, that you just ignore it. That's not a real thing. Don't look at that.
Yeah. And so now, I feel I've kind of just been in this season of learning to actually articulate what I want, and I don't want to say it's okay to be selfish, but kind of, it's okay to be selfish sometimes.
Well, I think it's important to draw a delineation between selfish and healthy boundaries and self-care.
Right.
Selfish is I don't care who I hurt. Self-care is I'm not willing to hurt myself.
Yes. Yeah.
Hey, I know you need things from me and you're asking things from me, but I'm not willing to hurt myself to give them to you.
Right.
You're going to have to address your own needs on your own, and I'll do what I can, but I'm not willing to cut my wrist for it, And
I feel in your late 20s too, making friends is very difficult, and finding relationships where you can actually be yourself is very difficult. And so it's kind of the season I'm in now. I'm really refining what those relationships look like for me, but
it gets harder too.
Yes. I imagine so.
It only gets harder. It only gets more difficult for some reason. And I don't know exactly what that is, but it's real.
But I don't think I'd have the discernment that I have now to know what healthy relationships and healthy church congregations and that kind of stuff looks like if I hadn't gone through all of that, even though it was toxic and verging on very problematic and not okay.
Yeah. So obviously there are personal individual examples of this for sure. I think everybody can probably identify some place where something that was painful was leading them into something that was actually going to be helpful. And if you can't, you might be in one of those places. And I encourage you to really, really look at that and pray about that. The other aspect I want to talk about is particularly the church in the West, and specifically the United Methodist Church in the state of Florida, the Florida Conference is what we call it. God has been sending drought and famine and pestilence to the Florida Conference of the United Methodist Church for 50 to 60 years.
Yep.
I don't know of a healthy church that is I won't speak that absolute. I have my opinions about it, but I'll speak more general than that. The overwhelming majority of churches are declining. And it seems to me that every time I have conversations with folks about those types of things, and I'm not talking folks, I'm talking leaders in the church. Broadly speaking, with exceptions, you know who you are if you're out there. But broadly speaking, it seems to me that the answer that I always get when I ask these questions is, we're going to keep doing what we've been doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for a long time, the church has been ignoring a very serious problem when it comes to, hey man, we don't seem to be making disciples. We don't seem to be doing the main focused thing that we claim to be about. And God is telling us over and over and over again, that's not what I want you to be doing to do that.
Right. It's about rules and polity and
membership. I think it's even worse than that now. I think it started there. I think that's where it started, kind of pharisaical,
Mm-hmm.
But now I think it has more to do with comfort and wealth.
Yeah.
And I don't want to change. I don't want to have new thoughts. I don't want to change my mind about anything. I don't want to be next to somebody who might make me uncomfortable. All those I paid good money and I put in my time, and I shouldn't have to deal with that anymore.
Right.
It's like, I think you've missed the entire point of discipleship.
Right.
Well, and who wants to get called out on the carpet when you're in charge, right? Like, you're supposed to be the example, and nobody wants to be the example that has to stand up and say, I messed up.
Mm-hmm.
So I was talking with somebody about leadership, and this is kind of another new church starty environment. And he was saying, when we first started, our board was made up of the people who we were trying to minister to, we were trying to attract. It was a board made up of those types of people. And then gradually, as things just got, as they found success and as things grew, he said he found himself more and more with a board filled with about 10 years older than him white guys. Like people who kind of were almost like his father figures that were working out. And it's because there's something there's something ingrained in what's going on that what we're seeking is power to make sure we are comfortable, to make sure we don't have to face things.
Yep.
And that when that's what leadership is about for us in the church, we get this word from Amos that says, hey, then I'll starve you to death. Then Yahweh says, then you will get no more. Then I will withdraw my favor. I will withdraw my providence. I will withdraw any protection that I was giving you, and you will just starve to death on the vine then, and I think, again, as I said last week, and I think this always comes with a prophetic word. We have a tendency in the Methodist Church, particularly in Florida, to want to focus on the grace of God, and the grace of God is in the judgment of God. We don't quite get that. And I know those are problematic phrases because they've often been weaponized against marginalized people. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about weaponizing judgment against the marginalized. Because if there's one thing we know from Jesus, we know that Jesus was a defender and on the side of the marginalized. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about judgment against the people who have power and the people who have authority and the people who have comfort and wealth and everything they need. God says you're misusing that. And if you are in one of those positions, then it needs to be for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, and you need to be open to this kind of word, and you need to be open to changing your mind, and you should be talking to people who make you uncomfortable, and you should be welcoming people who you disagree with, and you should be listening to other voices, and you should be using your power to lift up their voices. There's this real start, and that's grace. Mm-hmm. That's a part of how God works, and if we're going to be disciples, that's what we need to do. So we're running out of time. I do want to say we're getting a little more focused on outreach, and so if you have made it this far, then obviously something we did was curious and valuable to you. And if you have, then I encourage you to subscribe, and consider donating. 100% of the funds that you give to us through our PayPal account, they do not go to fund us. We have an investment fund that funds us. They go directly to, this month in particular, will go to relief for Hurricane Ian. So if you click on our PayPal and if you donate, then it will go directly to UMCOR, which 100% of those proceeds go directly to help people who have been victimized by this natural disaster. So I encourage you to consider donating, and I encourage you to, subscribe, and share, and help us get the word out. And I'm going to put a QR code somewhere. You can use a QR code, or there will be a link below. So may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.